In this chapter, we talk about psychedelics, LSD and psilocybin, and I want to take a minute to talk about Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was best known as the Harvard professor who championed the use of LSD. He used psilocybin in Mexico when he was 39, and he described it as the deepest religious experience of his life. And he said it changed him forever. And when he got back to Harvard, he started encouraging his students to use psychedelics. You don't do that. He eventually got fired, but he continued to encourage the use of psychedelics throughout his life. And he was instrumental in advancing their popularity, but he was also a part of the reason why they were categorized as a Schedule I drug. Now, Timothy Leary was a fascinating man. Regardless of how you think about him, he was fascinating. So here's just a few tidbits about his life. He was married 5 times. He spent time in 29 different prisons around the world. He went to West Point, but got kicked out because he failed to report infractions by other cadets. So they kicked him out. Let's see, later, after being found with a very small amount of marijuana on him, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison under the Marijuana Tax Act back from 1937. And he brought his case to the Supreme Court and won the Supreme Court case. And so the Marijuana Tax Act was declared unconstitutional in 1969. Now, the same day that the Marijuana Tax Act was overturned, Timothy Leary announced his candidacy for the governor of California. So he ran for governor of California against Ronald Reagan, and John Lennon actually wrote the song Come Together based on his campaign slogan. Now, Timothy Leary's campaign for governor was interrupted because he went to prison for a previous arrest for a marijuana possession. And what that arrest was, he had 2 roaches on him, 2 tiny amounts of cannabis, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for that. And upon arrival in prison, he was given psychological tests. He wrote some of these tests. Remember, he was a Harvard professor, so some of the tests they gave him, he actually wrote. And so he was able to manipulate his answers such that he was assigned to work as a gardener. And so they put him to work in the garden. He jumped the fence and escaped from prison. And then he spent years traveling the world, just evading arrest. He was recaptured and held on a $5 million bail, partly because President Nixon described him as the most dangerous man in America. So he went back to prison. He wrote numerous books while he was there. And after his release, he went on a lecture tour with G. Gordon Liddy of Watergate fame. Later in life, he got interested in space colonization, computers, and virtual reality. Timothy Leary died in 1995, and some of his ashes were placed aboard a rocket for his final trip. This rocket also carried Gene Roddenberry's remains, who created Star Trek. And these ashes circled the Earth for 6 years before they burned up on re-entry.